She walked into that courtroom, wearing a dress she bought at a thrift store, while her husband's mistress sat in the front row, draped in a $10,000 Chanel coat, smirking like she had already won. And honestly, they thought she had. Richard Sterling, one of the city's most ruthless real estate moguls, had the best lawyers money could buy. He had hidden the assets, forged the documents, and bought the narrative. He thought his wife Sarah was just a helpless woman he could discard like a used wrapper. But Richard made one fatal mistake. A mistake that would cost him his empire, his reputation, and his freedom. He didn't check the name on the judge's bench. He had no idea that the man holding the gavel was the father-in-law he had never bothered to meet. The rain in Seattle always felt like it was trying to wash the city clean, but on the morning of October 14th, it just felt cold. Sarah Sterling stood on the marble steps of the sprawling estate in Medina, the water soaking through her thin cardigan. Behind her, the heavy oak doors she had polished, doors she had decorated with wreaths every Christmas for 7 years, slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her chest. Minutes earlier, the humiliation had been absolute. Richard Sterling. A man whose smile had once charmed investors and magazine editors alike, stood in the foyer, checking his Rolex. He didn't even look at her. He looked through her. "The driver will take you to the motel on 4th. Richard had said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was a business transaction. "My lawyers have already sent the paperwork. Don't make a scene, Sarah. It's embarrassing." Standing next to him, gripping Richard's arm with a manicured hand, was Jessica Vane. Jessica was 24, a former marketing intern at Sterling Global, who had climbed the corporate ladder not by merit but by proximity. She wore Sarah's diamond earrings, the ones Richard had given Sarah for their 5th anniversary. She didn't try to hide it. She tilted her head, catching the light, making sure Sarah saw them. "You left your keys on the table, sweetie," Jessica cooed, tossing the brass key ring onto the floor near Sarah's feet. "We're changing the locks at noon anyway, but Richard prefers a clean break." Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She felt a numbness spreading from her fingertips to her core, a defense mechanism against the sheer brutality of the moment. 7 years. She had supported Richard when Sterling Global was just a risky startup. She had signed the loans with her own credit when the banks turned him away. She had nursed him through his stress-induced ulcers and covered for his drunken outbursts at galas. Now she was being evicted like a tenant who hadn't paid rent. "Richard," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I signed the prenup because I trusted you. You said it was just for the board. I said a lot of things." Richard cut her off, finally meeting her eyes. His gaze was cold reptilian. "People change. Business models evolve. You're an obsolete asset, Sarah. Jessica is the future. Now get out before I call security." The drive to the motel was silent. The motel was a generous term for the roadside inn Richard had booked her into. It was his final insult, sending the woman who helped build his fortune to a place with stained carpets and flickering neon signs, while he slept in silk sheets with his mistress. For 3 days, Sarah lay in the dark room, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her credit cards were declined. Richard's legal team, Archer and Associates, was a pack of wolves known for destroying spouses. They had filed a motion painting Sarah as mentally unstable and alcoholic and a spendthrift. They had doctored receipts. They had photos of her looking disheveled photos, taken during the week she had the flu, submitted as evidence of her inability to care for herself. It was a total demolition job. On the 4th day, Sarah ran out of cash. She had $12 left. She sat on the edge of the bed, her stomach growling, realizing she had two choices: surrender and sign the settlement that would leave her with nothing but debt or fight. But you can't fight a shark like Richard Sterling with $12. You need leverage. You need power. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a worn, leather-bound address book. She hadn't opened it in a decade. Her hands shook as she turned the pages past the friends who had already blocked her number because they wanted to stay on Richard's good side, past the distant cousins who wouldn't understand. She stopped at a name written in precise cursive ink. Arthur. She hadn't spoken to her father in 10 years. The last time she saw him, he had begged her not to marry Richard. He had called Richard a charlatan in a cheap suit and a soul-sucker. Sarah, blinded by love and rebellion, had screamed that she hated him. She had told her father he was a bitter, controlling old man who didn't understand passion. She had cut him off, changed her number, and never looked back. Richard, in his arrogance, had never asked about her family again. To Richard, Sarah was a creation of his own making. He assumed her family was poor, trashy, or dead. He never bothered to check. Sarah dialed the number, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Chambers of Justice Pendleton," a stern voice answered. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. I need to speak to the judge. Please, tell him it's Sarah." There was a long pause. "One moment." When the voice came back on the line, it wasn't the secretary. It was a deep, gravelly baritone that Sarah hadn't heard since her wedding day, the day he didn't attend. "Sarah?" She broke. The tears she had held back in front of Richard and Jessica finally burst forth. "Daddy," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Daddy, you were right. You were right about everything." The chambers of the Honorable Arthur Pendleton were a fortress of solitude and history. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal volumes dating back to the 1950s. The view from the window wasn't of the rainy streets, but of the formidable pillars of the State Superior Court. Arthur Pendleton was not just a judge. In the legal community, he was a legend. They called him the Iron Gavel. He was known for his terrifying intellect, his zero tolerance for theatrics, and his absolute, almost robotic adherence to justice. He was a man who had once held a CEO in contempt of court for checking his watch during a sentencing. He was also a man who had spent the last 10 years staring at a framed photograph of a smiling teenage girl on his desk, wondering if he would ever hear her voice again. When Sarah walked into his office, Arthur didn't stand up immediately. He watched her. He saw the cheap clothes. He saw the hollow cheeks. He saw the way she held her left arm, as if protecting herself from a blow. The anger he had nursed for a decade, the anger at her leaving, at her choosing that flash-in-the-pan hustler over her own blood, evaporated. All that was left was the protective instinct of a father. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite his desk. Sarah sat. She told him everything. She didn't sugarcoat her own stupidity. She admitted she had signed the prenup without reading the fine print. She admitted she had let Richard put all the assets in offshore shells. She admitted she had alienated everyone who warned her. "He has Archer and Associates." Sarah finished wiping her eyes with a rough paper towel. "They're going to bury me, Dad. They have affidavits saying I'm crazy. Richard has bribed the house staff to testify against me. I have nothing. I don't even have a lawyer." Arthur leaned back in his chair, tenting his fingers. His face was unreadable. "Richard Sterling." He said the name as if tasting something sour. "He's been making noise in the city. Zoning violations, labor disputes. He thinks the law is a suggestion." He thinks he owns the law, Sarah corrected. He told me he bought the judge. Arthur's eyes snapped up. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He said, I know the system, Sarah. I've already greased the wheels. The judge will sign whatever I put in front of him. Arthur remained silent for a long time. Then a very small, very cold smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted prey wandering into its den. He filed in the 4th District, Arthur said quietly. Family Court Division B. Yes, Sarah said. The hearing is next Tuesday. Arthur stood up and walked to the window. Judge Henderson was presiding over Division B, but Henderson had a stroke last Thursday. He's on medical leave for 6 months. Sarah looked at him confused. So what does that mean? Arthur turned around. It means they are rotating senior judges to cover the docket, to clear the backlog. It's a lottery system, usually. He walked over to his phone and dialed an internal extension. Margaret. This is Justice Pendleton. I'm looking at the rotation schedule for next week. I see there's a vacancy in Division B Family Court. Yes, I'll take the docket. All of it. I want to clear some pro bono hours. He hung up. Sarah's eyes went wide. Dad, you can't. Isn't that a conflict of interest if they find out? If who finds out? Arthur asked smoothly. Richard Sterling doesn't know who I am. You took your mother's maiden name, Bennett, when you started school, to avoid the pressure of my reputation. You married him as Sarah Bennett. On your marriage license, I'm listed as Arthur Bennett. Because of that clerical error, we never fixed, remember? And since you cut me out of your life, he never met me. To him, I'm just a name on a docket. But the name, Sarah stammered. Judge Pendleton. He'll know. Pendleton is a common name, Sarah, and Richard Sterling is a narcissist. Arthur said, his voice hard. Narcissists don't look at the people they consider beneath them. He sees a judge, he sees a bureaucrat. He won't look at my face. He'll look at his lawyer. Arthur walked around the desk and placed a heavy hand on Sarah's shoulder. You are going to walk into that courtroom alone. You will represent yourself. You will look weak. You will let him think he has won. You will let his mistress prance around. You will let his lawyers lie. Why? Sarah asked, trembling. Because, Arthur whispered, for a man like Richard Sterling to truly fall, he has to climb very, very high first. We are going to let him climb, and when he thinks he's touching the sky, I'm going to take the ladder away. Arthur reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote a check for $5,000 and slid it across the desk. Buy a suit, not a cheap one, but not flashy. Look like a woman who is trying to hold on to her dignity. And Sarah, yes, don't call me Daddy in court. You address me as Your Honor. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Arthur nodded. Good. Now go. I have a docket to review. The penthouse at the Obsidian Tower overlooked the entire city of Seattle. It was a glass cage in the sky costing $30,000 a month, a drop in the bucket for Richard Sterling. Inside, the air smelled of expensive leather and vanilla candles. Jessica Vane lounged on a sprawling white sofa, scrolling through her iPad. She wasn't looking at news. She was looking at wedding venues. Specifically, she was looking at the Villa d'Este in Lake Como. Do you think October is too chilly for Italy? She asked, not looking up. Richard stood by the wet bar, pouring a generous measure of Macallan 25. He swirled the amber liquid, admiring the legs on the glass. Book it for September. We'll be done with Sarah by then. Sitting across from them in a sleek armchair was Conrad Archer Richards' lead attorney. Conrad was a man who looked like he had been manufactured, not born. His suit was sharp enough to cut skin, his teeth were blindingly white, and his reputation was pitch black. He was known as the Butcher of Bel Air before moving his practice north. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Conrad said, though his tone suggested he wasn't worried in the least. "We drew Judge Pendleton." Jessica looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "Is that bad? I thought you said you knew all the judges." "I know the players," Conrad corrected smoothly. "Pendleton is old guard. He's a dinosaur. Doesn't go to the charity galas, doesn't play golf at the club. He's strictly by the book." Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "He's a bureaucrat, Conrad. They're all the same. He wants to clear his docket and go home to his cats. He doesn't want a messy trial. He'll look at the financials, see Sarah has no income and a history of instability, thanks to your excellent work, and he'll sign the settlement." Conrad nodded slowly. "We've filed the motion for an emergency injunction. We're claiming Sarah is dissipating marital assets, gambling, drinking. It's a lie, obviously, since she has no access to the accounts, but it puts her on the defensive. By the time she proves she's sober, the divorce will be finalized." Jessica stood up and walked over to Richard, wrapping her arms around his waist. She rested her chin on his shoulder, looking at Conrad. "I don't want her getting a dime, Conrad," Jessica said, her voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "She lived off Richard for 7 years. She's a leech. I want her to leave with the clothes on her back." "That is the goal," Conrad assured her. "We offered a settlement of $50,000. It's insulting considering the estate is worth $80 million. But she's broke. She's desperate. She'll take it." "And if she doesn't?" Richard asked. "Then we destroy her in open court," Conrad said, closing his briefcase. "We bring up the incident at the Christmas party." Richard smirked. The incident was completely fabricated, a story they had cooked up about Sarah throwing a wine glass at a waiter. They had paid the waiter $5,000 to sign an affidavit. "She's going to represent herself," Richard added, checking his phone. "My source at the clerk's office told me. She didn't file a notice of representation." Conrad chuckled, shaking his head. "Pro se against me. It's like bringing a plastic spoon to a gunfight. This won't take more than an hour." Jessica kissed Richard's cheek, her eyes gleaming with malice. She felt a thrill of power. She wasn't just the mistress anymore. She was the replacement. She had won. Sarah was just a ghost haunting a life that now belonged to Jessica. "I'm going to come tomorrow," Jessica announced. Richard frowned. "You don't need to be there, Jess. It might look aggressive." "I want to see it," she insisted, tightening her grip on him. "I want to see the look on her face when the judge tells her she's nothing. Besides, I'm your executive assistant, aren't I? I'm there for moral support." Richard sighed, then smiled. He liked her fire. It was so different from Sarah's quiet, boring loyalty. "Fine. Wear something modest. We're playing the victims here, remember? Sarah is the crazy ex-wife. We are the beleaguered professionals just trying to move on." "Don't worry," Jessica winked. "I'll look like an angel." The hallway outside courtroom 4B was a cavernous tunnel of polished stone and echoing footsteps. It was 8:45 a.m. on Tuesday. Sarah sat on a hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple navy blue suit she had bought at a consignment shop. It was clean, tailored, and conservative. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She wore no makeup. She looked exactly as Arthur had told her to look, like a woman, holding herself together with Scotch tape. Her heart, however, was beating so hard, she thought the security guard 10 feet away could hear it. "Just keep your head down," she told herself. "Don't look at them." The elevator doors at the end of the hall pinged. The sound of confident, clicking heels echoed against the stone. Then the heavier thud of expensive loafers. Sarah didn't look up, but she smelled them before she saw them. Richard's heavy musk cologne and Jessica's floral, cloying perfume. "Well, well," a voice sneered. Sarah looked up. Richard was walking past her, refusing to make eye contact, talking to Conrad Archer. But Jessica had stopped. Jessica was wearing a cream-colored pencil skirt and a silk blouse that cost more than Sarah's first car. She looked immaculate, glowing with health and wealth. "You actually showed up," Jessica said loud enough for the few other people in the hallway to hear. "I thought you'd be sleeping off a hangover." Sarah took a deep breath. "Leave me alone, Jessica." "Or what?" Jessica stepped closer, invading Sarah's personal space. "You're going to cry. You're going to beg Richard to take you back. He hates you, you know. He talks about how pathetic you were in bed, how boring." Sarah stood up. She wasn't going to sit there and take it. She moved to walk toward the courtroom doors, to escape the confrontation. As Sarah tried to pass, Jessica shifted her weight. It was subtle a movement practiced by high school bullies and corporate climbers alike. She stuck her foot out just an inch right in Sarah's path. Sarah's toe caught the heel of Jessica's Louboutin. Sarah stumbled forward, her arms flailing. She crashed onto the hard stone floor, her knees taking the impact with a sickening thud. Her purse spilled open, scattering pens and papers across the hallway. "Oh my God!" Jessica shrieked, feigning shock. "She attacked me! Did you see that? She tried to shove me!" Richard and Conrad turned around. Richard looked at Sarah on the floor, disgust written all over his face. "Get up, Sarah," Richard hissed. "Stop making a scene. Jesus, you're embarrassing yourself." "She tripped me," Sarah gasped, clutching her throbbing knee. She looked up at Jessica. Jessica was looking down at her, and for a split second, the mask slipped. Jessica smiled a cruel, tight smile. Then she made a motion with her foot, a subtle, sharp kick to Sarah's shin, as if moving a piece of trash out of her way. "Stay down, trash," Jessica whispered, so low only Sarah could hear. "Hey." The booming voice came from the courtroom door. A bailiff, a large man with a shaved head, strode into the hallway. "What is going on here?" the bailiff demanded. "She attacked my client's partner, Conrad Archer," said immediately, stepping in front of Jessica smoothly. "We were walking to the courtroom, and Ms. Sterling lunged at Ms. Vane. She seems unstable." The bailiff looked at Sarah, who was gathering her papers with shaking hands. He looked at the tears of pain in her eyes. Then he looked at Jessica, who was checking her nails. "Get inside," the bailiff grunted. "All of you. Judge is taking the bench in 2 minutes. Any more disturbances and I'm holding you in contempt before the gavel even drops." Sarah limped into the courtroom. She chose the table on the left, the defendant's table. It looked lonely. There was one chair, one pitcher of water, and her small stack of files. On the right, the plaintiff's table was crowded. Richard Jessica, sitting in the gallery directly behind him, Conrad and 2 junior associates, who were there just to carry boxes of documents. They laid out laptops, binders, and notepads. They looked like an army preparing to invade a small, undefended village. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. The door behind the high bench opened. Sarah held her breath. She kept her eyes on the desk. She was terrified that if she looked up and saw her father, she would break down. She was terrified that Richard would recognize him. Judge Arthur Pendleton walked in. He wore the black robe like armor. His hair was silver, his beard neatly trimmed. He wore reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the audience. He walked to the chair, sat down, and arranged his files with slow, deliberate movements. "Be seated," Arthur said. His voice was gravel. Richard Sterling sat down, leaning over to whisper to Conrad. "That's him. He looks like he's asleep." "Focus," Conrad whispered back. "Calling case number 49201, Sterling, V. Sterling," the clerk announced. "Appearances," Arthur said, not looking up. Conrad Archer stood, buttoning his jacket. "Conrad Archer for the plaintiff, Richard Sterling. We are also joined by Mr. Sterling today." Arthur made a note. "And for the defense." Sarah stood up. Her legs were shaking. Her knee throbbed where she had fallen. "Sarah Sterling. Your Honor, representing myself." Arthur stopped writing. He slowly lifted his head. Behind the thick lenses of his glasses, his eyes locked onto Sarah's. There was no flicker of recognition, no smile, no warmth. It was the gaze of the Sphinx. "Proce?" Arthur asked. "Ms. Sterling, this is a high-asset divorce case involving complex corporate holdings. Are you sure you wish to proceed without counsel?" "I cannot afford counsel, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice trembling, but clear. "My husband froze our joint accounts." Arthur shifted his gaze to the plaintiff's table. He looked at Richard Sterling for the first time. "Is this true, Mr. Archer?" Arthur asked. "Is the defendant without funds?" Conrad smiled, a shark showing its teeth. "Your Honor, Ms. Sterling has access to her personal savings. Furthermore, we have evidence that she has been squandering marital assets on illicit substances. We froze the accounts to preserve the estate. It was a necessary protective measure." Arthur stared at Conrad. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. It became uncomfortable. "Illicit substances," Arthur repeated flatly. "Yes, Your Honor. Alcoholism and erratic behavior." Arthur looked back at Sarah. "Ms. Sterling, are you drunk right now?" "No, Your Honor." "Are you under the influence of drugs?" "No, Your Honor." Arthur nodded. "Very well. Let's hear opening statements. Mr. Archer, you have the floor. Impress me." Conrad Archer strode to the center of the room. He didn't use notes. He was a performer. "Your Honor, this is a simple case of a marriage that has broken down due to the dangerous behavior of one party. Richard Sterling is a pillar of this community. He built Sterling Global from nothing. He has supported his wife for 7 years. In return, she has refused to work, refused to contribute, and recently has spiraled into addiction." Conrad pointed a finger at Sarah. "We are asking for the prenuptial agreement to be enforced strictly. We are asking for Ms. Sterling to vacate the marital home immediately, and given her instability demonstrated just moments ago in the hallway, where she physically assaulted Mr. Sterling's assistant, we are asking for a restraining order." Richard smirked. Jessica in the back stifled a giggle. They were winning. It was a slaughter. "Assault?" Arthur asked. He didn't sound angry. He sounded curious. "Yes, Your Honor," Conrad said. "She attacked Ms. Vane unprovoked. It was witnessed by my client." Arthur turned his chair slightly. He looked at the bailiff. "Deputy Miller," Arthur said. The bailiff stood at attention. "Yes, Your Honor. You were in the hallway. Did you witness an assault?" The room went deadly silent. Conrad Archer's smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected the judge to ask the help. Deputy Miller looked at Jessica Vane, then at Sarah. He crossed his massive arms. "I saw Ms. Sterling on the floor, Your Honor. I didn't see the start of it. But—" Miller paused. "Ms. Vane seemed to find the situation very funny." Arthur hummed. Funny. Yes, Judge. Arthur turned back to Conrad. Proceed, Mr. Archer. But be warned, I do not tolerate theatrics in my courtroom. If I find out you are wasting the court's time with fabricated drama, you will regret it. Conrad cleared his throat. Slightly rattled but recovering quickly. Of course, Your Honor. The facts will speak for themselves. They usually do, Arthur said cryptically. Miss Sterling, your opening statement? Sarah stood up. She looked at her notes, useless scribbles. She looked at Richard, who was checking his watch again. Your Honor. Sarah began, her voice gaining strength. I don't have a fancy speech. I helped build Sterling Global. I worked the phones. I did the books. I put my name on the loans. Richard wants you to believe I'm crazy, so he doesn't have to pay me what I earned. I'm not crazy. I'm just a wife who trusted the wrong man. She sat down. Richard leaned over to Conrad. That's it. That's her defense. She's toast. Arthur Pendleton adjusted his glasses. He picked up a document from the top of the pile. Mr. Archer, Arthur said, I'm looking at the financial disclosures filed by your client. You list the total value of the marital estate at $4 million. That is correct, Your Honor, Conrad said. Arthur flipped a page. And yet, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously soft, I have here a query regarding a holding company called Blue Heron LLC, registered in the Cayman Islands, a company that purchased a commercial block in downtown Seattle last month for $22 million. Richard Sterling froze. His skin turned the color of ash. Arthur looked over the rim of his glasses, his eyes piercing right through Richard's expensive suit. Mr. Archer, Arthur said, would you care to explain why your client's name is on the deed for a property owned by a company he claims doesn't exist? The silence in the courtroom following Judge Pendleton's question was heavy, suffocating. Blue Heron LLC, Conrad Archer repeated, stalling. He shuffled his papers, his confident facade showing its first hairline fracture. Your Honor, I am not familiar with that specific entity. It may be a dormant holding company. Dormant. Arthur Pendleton raised an eyebrow. It wired $200,000 to a J. Vane last week. Is that dormant, Mr. Archer? Or is that your client paying his mistress from hidden marital funds? Richard Sterling shot up from his chair. That's private business capital. It has nothing to do with Sarah. Sit down. Arthur's voice cracked like a whip. It wasn't a request. It was an order that vibrated through the wood of the bench. Richard sank back into his seat, stunned. He had expected a bored bureaucrat. He got a tiger. Arthur turned to Sarah. Miss Sterling, you may cross-examine the plaintiff regarding his financial disclosures. Sarah stood up. She walked toward the witness stand where Richard had been sworn in. Up close, she could see the sweat beading on his forehead. For 7 years, this man had made her feel small. He had made her feel stupid. But right now, he looked terrified. Richard, Sarah said, her voice steady. You swore in your affidavit that Sterling Global was operating at a loss this year. Is that true? Yes, Richard snapped, regaining some composure. The market is down. You wouldn't understand. You don't read the reports. I wrote the reports, Richard, Sarah said calmly, until you fired me. She picked up a piece of paper from her messy table. If the company is losing money, how did you afford the lease on the Obsidian Tower penthouse? It's $30,000 a month. Conrad jumped up. Objection. Relevance. Overruled, Arthur said instantly. Answer the question. Richard gritted his teeth. It's a corporate expense. For entertaining clients. Sarah nodded. And is Jessica Vane a client? She's an employee, Richard spat. An employee, Sarah repeated. What is her job title? Executive assistant. And what is the salary for an executive assistant at your firm? I don't know the exact figure. HR handles that. Sarah turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have here a copy of the payroll ledger from 6 months ago before I was locked out of the system. Jessica Vane was listed as an intern, earning $15 an hour. Yet according to the bank statement, Your Honor just referenced, she received a wire for $200,000. Sarah turned back to Richard, her eyes blazing. Did you give her a $200,000 bonus, Richard, while telling the court you couldn't afford to pay me spousal support? Richard's face turned purple. She does consulting. She brings in high-value targets. Like who? Sarah pressed. Name one client Jessica Vane brought in. Richard stammered. He looked at Conrad for help, but Conrad was busy frantically whispering to his junior associates, realizing they had walked into a minefield. I don't have the list in front of me, Richard muttered. You're lying, Sarah said simply. Objection argumentative, Conrad yelled. Sustained, Arthur said, though his eyes were dancing with a strange light. Ms. Sterling refrained from characterizing the witness, but the point is taken. Arthur leaned forward, clasping his hands. Mr. Sterling, let me remind you that perjury is a felony. If I find that you have hidden assets to avoid a divorce settlement, I won't just sanction you. I will refer this matter to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Richard swallowed hard. He looked at Jessica in the gallery. She was glaring at him, mouthing the word, "Fix it." Your Honor, Richard said, his voice taking on a wheedling, desperate tone. There seems to be a misunderstanding. The funds sent to Ms. Vane were a loan, a personal loan, to help her with family medical bills. A loan, Arthur repeated. Do you have a promissory note, a repayment schedule? It was a handshake deal. We are friends. Friends who sleep together in a penthouse paid for by the company, Arthur asked. We are not. Richard started to lie, then stopped. He realized lying to this judge was like trying to hold back the tide with a spoon. We are in a relationship. Yes. But that doesn't mean Sarah gets half my business. I built it with my credit, Sarah shouted, finally losing her cool. I signed the first loan, Richard. My name is on the incorporation papers. You erased me from the website, but you can't erase the signatures. Order. Arthur banged the gavel. Miss Sterling, lower your voice. Mr. Sterling, you are stepping on very thin ice. Arthur looked at the clock. We will take a 10-minute recess. When we return, I want Miss Vane on the stand. If she received marital assets, she is a party to this fraud. Richard went pale. He hadn't prepped Jessica. He thought she was just there for moral support. The recess was chaos. In the hallway, Conrad Archer was practically screaming at Richard in hushed, angry whispers. Jessica was fixing her makeup in her compact mirror, seemingly unbothered. He's out to get us, Richard hissed. That judge! He's looking at me like I killed someone. He's just a grumpy old man, Jessica scoffed, snapping her compact shut. Relax, Richard. I can handle him. I'll just cry a little. Say I didn't know the money was his wife's. Men like that eat up the damsel in distress act. Don't improvise, Conrad warned, wiping sweat from his upper lip. Just answer yes or no. Do not volunteer information. Back in the courtroom, the air was electric. Sarah sat at her table, her hands trembling. She had scored points, but she knew the war wasn't over. Call your next witness, Arthur ordered. We call Jessica Vane, Conrad said reluctantly. Jessica walked to the stand. She treated the aisle like a runway. She tossed her hair, smiled at the court reporter, and sat down with a delicate grace. She looked every inch the innocent beauty, if you ignored the predator's gleam in her eyes. "State your name for the record," the clerk said. "Jessica Vane." "Miss Vane," Conrad began, trying to guide her softly. "You are employed by Sterling Global." "Yes," Jessica said, her voice soft and breathy. "And you received a sum of money from Mr. Sterling recently. Was that a gift?" "Oh, no," Jessica said, wide-eyed. "It was a loan. My mother, she's very sick. I needed it for her surgery." Sarah gasped at the defendant's table. She knew for a fact Jessica's mother had passed away 3 years ago. Jessica had mentioned it at the company Christmas party when she was still an intern. Conrad saw Sarah's reaction and quickly moved on. "Thank you. And regarding the incident in the hallway this morning, did you feel threatened by Ms. Sterling?" Jessica looked directly at Sarah, a tear perfectly welling up in her eye. "Terrified. She's been stalking us. She calls Richard in the middle of the night, screaming, and today, she just lunged at me. She tried to scratch my face." "She's lying," Sarah blurted out. "Ms. Sterling," Arthur warned. "Your turn will come." "No further questions," Conrad said, looking relieved that Jessica had stuck to the script mostly. "Ms. Sterling," Arthur said. "Cross-examine." Sarah stood up. She walked slowly toward Jessica. She looked at the woman who had ruined her life, the woman wearing her jewelry. "Jessica," Sarah said, "you said the money was for your mother's surgery." "Yes," Jessica sniffled. "It's very hard for me to talk about." "I'm sure," Sarah said, "considering your mother died in 2023. The courtroom gasped. Jessica's eyes widened. She froze. I meant my stepmother," Jessica stammered fast. "I call her Mum." "What is her name?" Sarah fired back. Linda Jones." "We can check that," Sarah said, bluffing she had no idea. "But let's talk about something we can see right now. Those earrings you're wearing." Jessica instinctively reached up to touch the diamond studs. "What about them?" "They're beautiful," Sarah said. "Antique cut, 1.5 carats each. Where did you get them?" "Richard gave them to me," Jessica said defiantly. "For my birthday." Sarah turned to the judge. She looked Arthur right in the eye. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion, "those aren't just diamonds. They belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor Bennett. She left them to me in her will. They were in a safe in our home, a safe Richard emptied before kicking me out." Arthur Pendleton stopped breathing for a second. His face, usually a mask of stone, twitched. He knew those earrings. He had bought them for his mother with his first paycheck as a lawyer 40 years ago. His mother had passed them to Sarah. He looked at Jessica Vane, this spoiled, lying child, wearing his mother's legacy as a trophy of adultery. The pencil in Arthur's hand snapped. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Arthur stood up. He didn't look like a judge anymore. He looked like a storm cloud, given human form. "Miss Vane," Arthur said. His voice was no longer gravel. It was ice. "I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very, very carefully before you answer, because the bailiff is standing right behind you with handcuffs." Jessica shrank back in the chair, her confidence evaporating. What? Did you knowingly accept stolen property from Mr. Sterling?" I didn't know," Jessica wailed, pointing a finger at Richard. "He told me he bought them. He told me Sarah didn't want them. He said she threw them in the trash. She threw my mother's diamonds in the trash." Arthur repeated, his voice rising. "That's what he said," Jessica screamed, throwing Richard under the bus instantly to save herself. He said Sarah was trash, so she deserved nothing. He said he was going to leave her penniless, so she'd have to crawl back to her daddy. The mention of daddy hung in the air. Richard stood up, his face red. "Shut up, Jessica." "You shut up!" she shrieked back. "You told me the judge was a senile old fool. You said we'd be out of here in an hour." "Enough!" Arthur roared. The courtroom fell into a terrified silence. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. Arthur slowly sat back down. He took off his glasses. He placed them on the bench. He looked at Richard Sterling. He looked at Jessica Vane. And then he looked at Sarah. For the first time, he smiled at her. It was a sad, proud smile. "Mr. Archer," Arthur said softly to the stunned lawyer, "I believe your client just admitted to perjury, fraud, and theft in open court. And Miss Vane just admitted to conspiracy." Arthur reached for a file on his desk. He opened it. "There is one more matter to clear up before I issue my ruling," Arthur said. "Mr. Sterling, you made a comment about Sarah crawling back to her daddy." Richard wiped his face, looking confused and defeated. "It was just a figure of speech, Your Honor. She hasn't spoken to her father in years. He's nobody." Arthur Pendleton leaned forward. "Is that so?" Arthur asked. "Well, Mr. Sterling, it seems you didn't do your due diligence." Richard Sterling blinked, confusion warring with the panic rising in his chest. I don't understand, Your Honor. I checked into her family. Her father was a nobody named Arthur Bennett. He was just some low-level clerk." Arthur Pendleton stood up slowly. He seemed to grow taller, his shadow casting long over the bench. He reached into his robe and pulled out a small framed photograph, the one that had sat on his desk for 10 years. He turned it around so the courtroom could see. It was a picture of a smiling teenage girl in a graduation cap hugging a man in a suit. The girl was Sarah. The man was a younger, less grey Judge Arthur Pendleton. "You are half right, Mr. Sterling," Arthur said, his voice resonating with a terrifying calm. "My name was Arthur Bennett. I changed it to Pendleton, my mother's maiden name, 20 years ago, when I took the bench to honor her legacy. The same legacy you just allowed your mistress to dangle from her ears." Richard's eyes went wide. He looked from the judge to Sarah. The resemblance once hidden by Sarah's sadness and Arthur's age was now undeniable. The same jawline, the same steel in the eyes. "You," Richard choked out. "You're—" "I am the nobody," Arthur said. "I am the father-in-law you never bothered to meet because you were too busy building a fortune on my daughter's back. I am the man whose warnings she ignored to marry you. And I am the judge who is about to end your career." Jessica Vane let out a small squeak of terror. She began fumbling with the earrings, trying to unclasp them. "I'm taking them off." "Here, I didn't know." "Bailiff," Arthur barked. "Secure the witness. Those earrings are stolen property and evidence in a criminal investigation. Remove them." Deputy Miller moved with surprising speed. Jessica screamed as she was pulled up from the chair. Conrad Archer, the slick lawyer, was already packing his briefcase. He knew when a ship was sinking. He wasn't going to go down with it. "Your Honor, I would like to request a recess to advise my client." "Denied," Arthur said. "This court has heard enough. I am issuing a summary judgment." Arthur looked at Richard, who was now trembling visibly. "Sterling, you have admitted to hiding assets. You have admitted to perjury. You have admitted to fraud. You attempted to use this court as a weapon to abuse your wife further." Arthur picked up his pen. I am hereby declaring the prenuptial agreement null and void due to fraudulent non-disclosure of assets. All assets held by Sterling Global Blue Heron LLC and any other shell companies you have created are frozen effective immediately." "You can't do that," Richard shouted, desperation stripping away his sanity. "That's my company. I built it." "You built it with community funds," Arthur corrected. "And since you tried to hide it, the penalty is severe. I am awarding 100% of the marital assets to the plaintiff, Sarah Sterling." 100%, Richard screamed. "That's illegal." "You're biased. You're her father." "I am a judge who just watched a man confess to a felony," Arthur said coldly. "And speaking of felonies, Deputy Miller." "Yes, Your Honor. Take Mr. Sterling into custody. I am holding him in contempt of court for his outburst, and I am referring the evidence of tax evasion and fraud to the district attorney. I'm setting bail at $5 million. Richard lunged toward the bench, his face twisted in hate. "I'll ruin you. I'll have your badge. I know people." 2 officers tackled him before he got past the bar. Richard Sterling, the man who thought he owned Seattle, was dragged out of the courtroom screaming like a child, his expensive suit bunching up around his neck. Jessica Vane was escorted out right behind him, sobbing about how she was just an intern and didn't do anything wrong. When the doors slammed shut, the silence that followed was heavy. Arthur stood there for a moment, breathing hard. Then his shoulders slumped. He looked at Sarah. She was still standing at her table, tears streaming down her face. "Court is adjourned," Arthur whispered. He stepped down from the bench. He didn't go to his chambers. He walked right through the swinging gate of the bar. He walked up to Sarah. "I'm sorry, Daddy," Sarah sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "I'm so sorry." Arthur pulled her into his arms. He held her tight, just like he had when she was a little girl, and scraped her knee. But this wound was deeper, and it would take longer to heal. "It's okay, Sarah." Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. You're home." It took 6 months for the dust to settle. Richard Sterling didn't make bail. His friends and investors abandoned him the moment the news hit. Archer and Associates dropped him as a client when the checks bounced. He eventually pleaded guilty to 3 counts of wire fraud to avoid a 20-year sentence. He is currently serving 5 years in a minimum security facility in Oregon. He spends his days working in the prison laundry, earning 12 cents an hour. Jessica Vane avoided jail time by testifying against Richard. She moved back to her hometown in Ohio. Last anyone heard, she was working at a mall kiosk, selling cell phone cases, telling anyone who would listen that she used to be a high-powered executive in Seattle. As for Sarah, she didn't keep Sterling Global. She sold the company's assets, the penthouse, and the cars. She took the money, nearly $40 million after taxes and fines, and started a foundation. The Bennett Initiative provides legal aid and financial support to women trapping in abusive financial relationships. On a rainy Tuesday 1 year later, Sarah walked into a small coffee shop near the courthouse. She wore a simple raincoat and the diamond earrings that had once belonged to her grandmother. Sitting at a corner table reading a newspaper was an older man with silver hair. "Your Honor," Sarah smiled, sitting down opposite him. Arthur looked up, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I told you it's just Dad outside the courtroom." "Old habits?" Sarah laughed. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Lunch is on me today. I think I can afford it." Arthur squeezed her hand. "I'm just glad you can afford to smile again." They sat there for hours talking not about law or money, but about the future. Sarah had learned the hard way that money couldn't buy loyalty and power couldn't buy love. But sometimes justice was priceless, and the best part, Richard Sterling never knew that the judge who took his life away wasn't acting out of vengeance. He was just doing his job. It just so happened that his job was protecting his daughter. And that is the story of how Richard Sterling lost everything because he underestimated the quiet woman he married and the powerful man who raised her. It's a brutal reminder that you should be careful who you step on while you're climbing the ladder, because you never know who is holding it steady for you. Richard thought he was the king of the world, but he forgot the most important rule of the jungle. Never mess with a wolf's cub while the alpha is watching. What do you think? Did Richard get what he deserved, or was the judge too harsh by taking 100% of the assets? And would you have forgiven your father after 10 years of silence like Sarah did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who needs a little satisfaction today, and subscribe so you never miss our next real-life drama story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.